Today we will see 3 horror stories based on real events. Like the video, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell for more content like this. Thank you. My name is Carlos. I'm 45 years old, but my experience happened when I was 15 years old on my grandparents' farm. My father grew up on a farm in the mountains of the state of Oaxaca, Mexico. His parents never knew another reality other than being surrounded by cattle and plantations. My grandfather milked milk all his life, and my grandmother sold cheeses on neighboring farms and communities. They had 7 children, as was the custom before my father was one of those middle children since I was little. Dad always took me and my 2 brothers to visit our grandparents. The truth is that we had a lot of fun, and as I was the youngest of the 3, you can say that I was the more spoiled. I loved being with them. Many times my mother would get angry because I would rather be with my grandmother than with her, but let's face it, when you are little you never measure the importance of these things. You simply are where you feel best, and the pampering and affection from my grandparents always made me feel something different. Something I remember very well. It's just that my grandmother, may she rest in peace, was a very religious person. We lived on a farm, and I didn't have many opportunities to go to church as it was somewhat remote, but I still had a Bible at home, and every night I stayed with my grandparents. My grandmother taught me to pray alongside her many. You can say it was boring, but in a way I really liked my grandmother's voice. It was soft and calm. I also really liked the way she read. Her tone of voice, it was very calm. I remember very well that my AV with her on certain occasions, he told her that no, it was good that she was so involved in religion. Let's just say he was a little grumpy. It wasn't that he didn't believe in God, he was always looking for something to complain about. He had a dog's sense of humor, as my grandmother used to say. Time was unfortunately passing by as the years went by. The stays at my grandparents' farm became shorter, more than anything else for school reasons and to help my father with his homework. They visited us, but not very often. When they did this, it was simply because they had to go into town to buy supplies. Even though I was busy, I tried to visit them on vacation. At that time I was 15 years old, and I really liked helping my grandfather. I don't know why, but I always liked the countryside. It relaxes me and gives me a lot of peace of mind. That's why I really liked being with him, going out in the morning to milk and coming back in the afternoon to lock up the cows. I have very beautiful memories with him. The food, the weather, everything was perfect. Once when I was on his farm, I remember very well that we were milking. It was very early in the morning, and suddenly I heard my grandfather start complaining. I quickly approached him, but he told me to move away. He told me to be careful with the snake, as it had just attacked him. He grabbed his machete and in one attempt broke it in 2. He put a cloth on his leg and ran towards the house. When we arrived, my grandfather said he was just a little dizzy, but nothing to worry about. He just asked me a favor to pick up the milkings we had left in the barn that day. My grandfather spent most of the day in bed, something I knew he didn't like, as he was always working. But in the afternoon he accompanied me to see if everything was in order in the corral and started counting the number of animals there. Inside, I was next to him doing the same. He commented that one was missing. He was sure he had seen it there in the morning. I still didn't know the cattle like him, so I didn't really understand which one he was speaking. He told me that we were going to look for her. It was a little late. The sun was setting. When heading home, my grandmother realized our intentions and said that there was no reason for her to let my grandfather go out. He tried to tell her that it was okay, that it wasn't, I needed more rest. But she didn't listen. I just said no and no. They started arguing, and I honestly didn't like that, so to calm the situation down, I told them I could go look for the cow. Anyway, I already knew my grandfather's land. It wasn't like I was going to get lost. My grandfather agreed, but my grandmother didn't. Once again, they started arguing. My grandmother said it could be dangerous, and they couldn't let me go alone. My grandfather argued that I was already 15 years old, and that nothing would happen to me in the end. She reluctantly agreed. I told them that I would take the dog for company. They both asked me to pay attention where I was stepping. I had to return before dark. I took a machete, and I remember very well what he said to me. Don't take too long. You already know that your grandmother doesn't like it. I called the dog, and we both started to walk away. I walked for a few minutes. The animal came fine beside me, playing. There were parts of the road where it was possible to see the hill. The colors were wonderful. After a few minutes, there was still no sign of the cow, according to the description my grandfather gave me. It was black, with a huge white spot on my back. I continued advancing along the paths, but nothing was empty. I started to play with the dog. I threw a branch to him, went looking, and a few seconds later brought back. Was so that the minutes passed. I looked everywhere, but there were only trees. I was getting stressed, but didn't want to go back without the cow. Was the first time my grandfather was not with me, and I did not want that. I could do things without him. Walked until we got closer to a stream. At that time the sun didn't take long for itself. I was already giving up. Was there that the dog began to climb the riacho. I followed him, and it was there I saw her. The cow was almost halfway, eating calmly. I approached and I tried to drive her, but she did not move. I started to worry. The shadows consumed the trees around. When I finally got the animal Starting to move, there was not much sunlight left. I knew my grandparents would reproach me, but I was still proud to have managed to find the cow. Who is from small town or farm will understand me in those places. The nights are so dark, in the back moon lit my way at least a little bit. The cow was in front of me and the dog next to me. Suddenly the dog began to shave. It seemed to be going towards something behind us. I looked back, but I only found a way dark, surrounded by dark trees. I didn't know how much I had walked. I wasn't sure where I was, but I was sure I knew the way back again. The dog started to get restless. I started turning my face back. Was there? I noticed something black in the middle of the way. It seemed to be a person. Honestly, it gave me scratches. I felt an uncomfortable tingling in the legs. The dog back a bit, stood by my side and continued roaring. I thought of continuing walking and ignoring what was behind me, but after a few seconds I turned and that thing was still there at the same distance from me. I had no doubt was following me. "Good night," I said with fear, but there was no response. I was nervous. I was watching if it would pass through me and it would continue its way. But she or he seemed to be waiting for someone and didn't move at the time. When I looked with a more fixed look, I realized that she was dressed in black and wearing a tunic like those I sometimes saw the nuns of my city wearing. It made me uncomfortable. I started to feel something very heavy in the chest. There was a sound of crying. I wasn't sure if it was she who was doing this because it seemed to come from among the trees. At first I thought it could be the wind shaking the leaves, but then I realized that it was really like a cry. I continued walking with the heart sunk in the chest, dominated by an unpleasant feeling. I did not know how long I had left, but needed to get to my grandparents' house as soon as possible. In front of me, the way disappeared among the trees. Suddenly the cow stopped. I don't know why, but she refused to follow forward. The dog continued to lick, and I didn't even know what to do. I tried to do animal forward, but nothing. I didn't want to look back again. I picked up a dry branch that was near the way. I approached the cow, and by the sing of the eye, I noticed a movement next to me. I looked up, and there I was, started to get agitated. All the hair of my arms, if scratched. That woman was less than 1 meter from me. It was at this moment that I confirmed she was dressed as a nun. There was no logic, because a nun would be in the middle of nothing, and even more in my grandfather's lands, was impossible. "Good night," I said. Knew I was shaking the woman, or at least it was what I thought was. Remained silent for a moment. I felt a very strong anguish. I knew something was wrong. With a very weak voice, she told me that it came from my grandmother. I couldn't understand. I didn't know the friends of my grandparents, but doubted that woman was talking to truth. After a moment, and with a lot of fear, I asked what was my grandmother's name. Was the first thing that came up to me, and obviously there was no answer. I looked at her for a few more seconds. The silence that surrounded us was very deep. I felt as if even the wind had stopped blowing. I realized that in front of me the cow began to walk. I thanked God and I began to follow her all the way. That woman continued following me. The dog did not stop laughing. I felt very bad. My legs didn't respond very well. They hanged at every step. In the distance I began to distinguish the lights from the farm. From my grandparents I felt my soul begin to return to my body, yet so I was afraid to look at the sides. My attention was completely turned to the animal in front of me. I still heard her behind me, but I realized that the more I walked farther, it seemed as if I was being left behind. Far I perceived a light. Someone was approaching. The horse, fortunately, was my grandfather. When he got close enough, he told me he was very worried not to see me come. He was looking for me for some time and could not find me. Already it was almost 4 hours since I left. I surprised me. It was not possible. Did not all this time I had gone. While I thought he asked me if this is all right, I tried to keep calm, but he told me, "You're very pale. What happened to you?" I looked back. Obviously, there was nobody else there. "I tried to convince you that everything was under control. I didn't want to worry you." The woman had already left on the way back. None of us two said anything, but I'm sure my grandfather knew something was happening. He told me to hurry up, and I climbed on the horse with him. I stayed silent for a long time. I could stop thinking of the woman who came after me and what she had told me. Coming home, my grandmother waited for us at the door. She looked at me very worried. When I approached, she gave me a kiss and a hug. She told me I was very pale. I simply told her I couldn't find the way back. I didn't have any desire to eat. I didn't even touch the food plate. I remained silent most of the time. Both looked at me all the time. I remember very well that same night, while helping my grandmother to wash the dishes, I approached her, and still thinking about it, I told her that there was a woman among the trees following me along the way. She looked at me strangely. There was no way to have a woman up there in the mountains. I thought the same, but I couldn't give her an explanation for this. Was a woman dressed as a nun. She was coming after me. She followed me the greatest part of the way. Told me that you sent her. I confessed to my grandmother in a low voice. She remained silent for a moment. A scourge went through my body. My grandma told me maybe they were sending somebody to take care of me, but I knew it was nothing of that. That woman left me very uncomfortable. It gave me a feeling of sadness and despair. I repeat, it was as if it was something of evil, as if there was something that made me feel in danger. I got several days like this. I was even afraid to leave the house. When there was no daylight, I felt like something was watching me through the trees all the time. My grandmother didn't touch the subject anymore. She neither mentioned it then. She just acted like it had never happened. My grandfather was the one who tried to distract me and seemed more attentive. He no longer let me do things alone. I don't know why, but I never told him anything about what happened. I didn't want he argued with my grandmother and caused another problem between them as time passed was something that I simply tried to forget. When I remember telling myself that maybe my mind imagined it, I prefer to think that one between the trees did not exist. But at the same time, it is even more difficult when I recall the voice of that thing. I feel a horrible weight on my shoulders. I imagine his shadow in the middle of that dark path and my legs weaken. I live in a small inner town. The population is only 4,000 people, and the nearest city is a few hours away. Most people who live here are very close, as there were so few people nearby. Everyone knew each other, and everyone knew of everything that was happening. At the time I was in high school and had a best friend called Chris, with whom I was dating virtually every day in the middle of autumn. Close friends talked a lot about an empty farmhouse in the city that people were interested in exploring and making illegal parties there. I never went to do this kind of thing, but Chris, yes, and I would be lying if I said that I was not even a little curious. Supposedly that property was left behind by owners for years, left to rot in the outskirts of the city. For the last 5 years, the rumors about it spread like a fire, as it was a place for most people to do all kinds of nasty thing that you can imagine. Was a weekend night that Chris talked about it. For me, we had nothing else to do, and Chris seemed very excited to see the place before they destroyed it at once, or they tired of drogged. After finding some lanterns, we entered the car and we went to the farmhouse. Only we knew on which road it was, but it was not very difficult to find it. You could see the rotten house at a distance, the entrance. However, we could not find it. Was probably already covered with vegetation a long time ago. We parked on the road and we started walking through the countryside towards this house. It was almost one morning, so the moon lit field just enough to navigate. As we approached, it almost seemed like everything around was silent. The house had weeds infesting the whole place. Chris went ahead, walking to the front of the house where the door was missing. It gave us easy access to the inside. We entered and we started walking through the rooms, looking at Leo on the floor and the interior in decomposition. It made us both wonder, because she had been abandoned. We went up to the second, was much darker up there. There were no windows to let even a light. We both turned on our lanterns and lit them. There were only 2 rooms up there, one on the left side of the hallway and another on the right side. Chris went up. The left was totally empty with mold covering the ceiling and nothing else. There was a single window with crocheted wooden boards. Curious, I went up there because they would need to lock one on it. Upstairs, I bowed to investigate and looked to see what was out there. Maybe had access to the roof or something, but not. This was just a common window facing the field from where we came. We kept looking at the place, and in the other room there was a room where at the bottom of the chamber there were drugs, possibly from the people of the school who said they were going to come to the place. I decided to go call Chris to go away, and as I went down the stairs I heard a cry of pain followed by a request for help. Running down there because I knew the screams were from my friend. When I arrived in what it seemed the room, I pointed the lantern to a hole in the floor, and there was Chris screaming with a horrible cut in the leg next to what seemed to be a desperate body. I pulled him and I turned to point the lanterns down. Was actually a body, was of a man of bruises and was not there for a long time, because neither Fedia nor anything helped Chris to get back to the car, and we got out of there as fast as possible. On the way back, Chris called the city police and they told us to wait at a gas station, that they would come to meet us. We did what they asked us, and it didn't take more than 15 minutes for them to show up. We went with them to the spot and we were waiting in the car while they were going to the house to see the said body. However, it did not take even 5 minutes for them to come back and say that there was nothing there. The police were, with a face of anger, said that what we did could be titled as a crime. We swear that it was not a lie. But they did not believe and sent us to the hospital, heal the wound of the leg of Kai's. We ended up doing the opposite, and we came home very scared as not. There was no body there. I was not the only one to see. We were not crazy. There was someone else in that place and removed the body from there before we came back. I don't believe the cops would lie about there's nothing there. I'm almost sure that Kai's and I got face to face with death that day. I still have perfectly the image of the body in my head, but I didn't see his face since he was bruises. The following days I was watching the news, both in the newspapers and on the internet. No one had disappeared around. It was a very small town. As I mentioned, if something like that happened, I'd know. Quickly, my name is Alexander. I am currently 55 years old, and I grew up with my brothers on a farm in the interior. What I'm going to tell happened to me in my childhood. Since small, my parents taught us to be independent, to work the earth and livestock. Since children, we used to living among animals and crops was a life wonderful. We woke up very early to drink the milk served directly to the table of the cow. The cheeses and meats were fresh. We loved to run through my father's fields, to bathe in the river, and climb trees. Most of the products we consumed were grown or produced in the same farm. We only bought the essential in the nearest city to the land of my parents. One thing we also did was that, as we did not live very far from a river, we drank direct water from there. The journey to this river, it lasted approximately 30 minutes. Every 2 or 3 days we descended from the donkey in search of water to take to the farm. The people responsible for the search for water were the boys of the house more than anything, because we were the ones responsible for a little heavier work. My sisters helped in other things of the home. I remember very well that day it was me and my brother Luis that we had to go get water. We were both Little at the time, I was about 10 years old, and he 12. My mother had already warned us early that we should do this, but as my father was not at home, we did not pay much attention to what she asked us. Almost all afternoon passed, so we were joking, while our mother always reminded us that we needed to go get water. Was beginning to get dark, and we still had not eaten get the blessed water. When our father arrived, he was almost exploding. My brother and I tried to justify each other, but did not advance. My father was a very tough and angry person. I think they are all because of the hard life of the countryside, he said, almost whispering that we had to go get water. At that exact moment, I remember that I felt my heart firing. The idea of having to walk almost half an hour in the dark scared me. However, my father gave me more fear at that time. We did not have electricity on the farm because it was a place where only our family lived. We tried notify him that we're going tomorrow morning, but my father didn't listen to us, neither let us talk. We started to prepare the donkey. We raised the pots for the water and said, let's go to my brother. We have to go, otherwise things are going to get worse for us. He replied angrily. I entered the kitchen. My mother was preparing her dinner and told him calmly if we could go tomorrow. She simply replied that our father had the last word. I stayed right next to her and didn't. You think if I ask our father he'll change his mind? He's not going to hurry before it's dark. My brother replied. Our house was on the top of a hill, and the river was on its slopes. Thinking the way we'd have to follow gave me a lot of fear. We started our journey. The only thing that lit us was the light. The light created shadows. Strangers in the trees. I was just trying to concentrate on the road in front of us. At some point my brother and I stayed silent. I held the lightning, and he wakes up from the donkey. In these kinds of places there were many night animals. Movements and noises could be heard everywhere. Besides, the ass began to go crazy from nowhere, which left us even more scared. I remember very well that when child what we used to do to scare us was to tell each other scary stories. Unfortunately, during that trip these stories couldn't come out of my head. Wolf men, the woman crying in the middle of the bush, spirits and entities passed through my head all the time. My mother always said that fear feeds these things, and I did not doubt. However, as I was not going to be scared, was just a child, we continued to walk. The road was narrow, the light of the lighthouse not. It exceeded 1 meter. We couldn't see almost anything. But that didn't bother us, because we already knew the way. A few minutes later we started to hear the water running. I felt like I could breathe again. No longer. We were so far. We reached the limit, and we started moving forward. My father always told us to never drink water from the banks, always had to be from the center of the river. When we were in the middle, Lewis began to fill the pots with water. I held the light too, that he could do the work. Because of his nervousness, I looked at all sides, attentive to everything that he saw. Happily, our eyes were already accustomed to the moon, which made everything much easier. The distance from nothing on the other side of the river, I could see something. The first thing I thought was that it could be a horse due to his silhouette. I continued looking towards that precise light. Here Louise said I was angry. After a few seconds again, I looked at the bank of the river in front of us. I began to notice that the black silhouette that was in the corner began to move in our direction. A ripe crossed my neck. It looked like a horse, and someone was riding on it. I turned away the look quickly. I thought it was all my imagination. I pointed the lightning to Lewis, and I tried not to look at that again. You ended up asking, trembling. Fear. I'm almost finished. My brother answered me. It was clear to me that it was a person on horseback. I could see his silhouette, but I couldn't distinguish anything else. I didn't say anything to my brother. I thought it was all in my head. Shortly after, Louise raised his eyes and saw him also. Is our father, he said to me in a low voice. We both stay silent. The silhouettes approached us until we were a few meters away. The ass began to get crazy again. He tried to get away, but my brother grabbed him. It seemed like it was a man was very close, but not enough for the light of the lightning to reach him. Gradually we managed to distinguish the head of the black horse. Something that was stuck in my mind was the size of the animal. I got as close as I could from my brother's good night. A man's voice told us he wasn't our father. None of us moved. I felt like my legs trembled underwater. Good at night, my brother replied. The little I saw of him indicated that this man was dressed entirely in black. There was silence. No one said anything. The horse did not move. The only thing that could be heard was his breath. My brother ran to fill the jar with water. What worried me most was that it seemed that that man could not stop watching us, was as if his face was turned toward us all the time. And his horse, I don't know, but it gave me an uncomfortable feeling. Lewis is done with the water. Good night, sir, he said. Before moving, the man did not respond. We began to move towards the coast. The horse was following us. My brother and I was very close. We were both dying of fear. It was not normal someone to be there at that time. Our farm was about 3 hours from the nearest city, and the way to get there was not. It was through the river. When we finally got to earth behind us, we still heard the spores of the boots of the man beating on the horse. He continued to advance through the water. We began to walk on firm ground, hoping that the guy would stay behind. But not. He was following us. I was very afraid that our only Lucia wiped. It seemed that it was getting weaker and weaker. There was a silence. The animals around the woods were silent, nor were the insects heard. As if we were only ourselves in the middle of nothing. The only thing that stood out was the breath of the horse that was very deep. I tried to turn around slightly to see them, and despite the darkness of the night, I managed to distinguish them. The animal had a very strange face. I had never seen anything like this in my life. Was as if he was smiling. I looked forward again. My arms trembled. The horses began to make a horrible sound. My brother grabbed my hand. My eyes began to fill with tears. I was scared. Luis, very quiet, told me not to be afraid because he was with me. Our donkey began to get nervous, and one of the water pots fell on the floor. My brother tried to control the animal so that he did not run to the trees. Luis asked me to hold the rope well and not to release. He climbed on the animal and fortunately managed to calm him. With fear, I looked at the road behind us. There was no one else. We both looked to all sides. There was no sign of him or his horse still, so the way back was very difficult. Luis was riding on the donkey and I was on his side. When we finally got home, my father was waiting for us at the entrance to help us with the water. The first thing he asked us was why we took so long. He was about to go looking for us when he saw our faces, asked us what there was happened. We were pale. After a break, my brother told him that there was a man in Rio. A man? But who? He asked. I think his first thought was that we were taking off with his face, but by our faces it was obvious that not knowing said to him that it was a guy dressed in black. We could not see his face, but his arms were long and looked very thin. He was there following us, riding on his huge horse. Our confused father asked us where this or where had gone. We answered that we didn't know, that it just disappeared. When the donkey started to go crazy for the third or fourth time, it was the first time my father heard of something, so he asked us repeatedly if we were lying to him. I, almost crying out of fear, said no. My father took the lightning and rode on the horse. He went looking around his property. My mother stayed at home with us. She closed all the doors. While my father did not arrive, she was very scared, but also relieved that we were by her side. When Daddy came back, he told us that he did not find anything, that the darkness of the night did not help him much. The next day, he went out again but found no one, but said that on the way he found huge footprints of what seemed to be a horse. My father, I was angry because it was possible that someone had invaded their lands without permission. Every time I heard him say that, didn't know how to explain to him if he had seen or heard the same thing. That I doubt would not be scared. My mother in turn taught us some prayers that she knew. She told us that the next time we felt something strange around us, nothing could happen to us if prayer was on our side. Since that night, my brother and I used to remember that moment. We tried to give some logical explanation, but we always came to the same thing. There was no chance of being someone from the area around our rancho. I was very far from all the weight of the environment, the behavior of our ass, of his horse's voice, I don't know. But there were many things that made me think. There were stories in the city that described a character like a tall man walking on a horse. Many said that he was a character related to death, that he came for those who were close to dying. However, me and my brother are here alive and well with the memory of that day, an unexplained and frightening day.